Lamenters.
My boys, loyalists.
Crimson Slaughter.
Traitors.
Dark Angels.
Loyalists.
Traitors.
Why traitors?
After what they did to make things worse during the Siege of Rax, I can't think otherwise.
Well, you're both right then. Flesh Terrors.
Traitors.
No, Pio, they are loyalists. Blood Angel successors under Gabriel's set.
What idiot chose to name a loyalist chapter Flesh Terrors then?
They were named after Nassiramit, nicknamed the Flesh Terror during the Great Crusade and Horus Heresy.
It is still a stupid name to call a loyalist chapter. It is what I imagine the name of an edgy emo warband of Marines will be.
Marines Malevolent.
Loyally traitor.
Damn it, Pio crashed again.
I reboot him.
And all of this before I even asked of the Red Corsairs.
Red Corsairs? From the name, they seem interesting.
You are in luck then, because today we will talk of the events that ended up creating them in the first place. We just need for Pio to reboot, then we can move forward.
Definitely loyalists.
Strangely enough, yes. So, next one. Alpha Legion. Peace is a vain wish. Our crusade might one day adopt another name, but it will never truly end. In the far future, there will be only war.
Two crashes in a day, that isn't good for my brain.
Well, you can stop thinking about it. Today we talk of another interesting chapter in the history of the Imperium, and one of the bloodiest conflicts to ever happen between Imperial and Renegade forces.
If we talk about Gog Van Dire, I'm preparing myself for jokes about Doge and Fit.
No, Pio. Today we talk about a conflict between loyalist forces, that only after certain events became a conflict between loyalists and traitors. In fact, today we talk about the Badab War.
Damn, that is a long story. Can we fit it in one video?
Probably not. In fact, I expect it to be covered in 2 or 3 videos, but that is not important right now. To understand the events that went down during the Badab War, we need to start by explaining where it takes place and what brought to fruition the events that will start a giant civil war between loyalist forces. The events we are going to talk about take place in a part of the galaxy known as the Maelstrom Zone, a territory of space partially near, partially inside a giant warp vortex near the galactic core of the Milky Way galaxy. This vortex was in fact known as the Maelstrom. The territory of the Maelstrom was inhospitable to say the least. During the late 40th and early 41st millennium, the Imperium saw a surge of attacks by malignant forces that originated from inside the Maelstrom. They weren't small attacks either. The forces emerging from the Maelstrom were slaughtering hundreds of thousands of people every time they attacked, ravaging hundreds of planets and star systems in the proximity of the Maelstrom, and even slowly eroding the merchant shipping lanes that Imperial ships used to transport materials from the Maelstrom to more established systems outside of it, by assaulting convoy after convoy of transport ships every time they had the chance to do so. And we are not talking about a single type of enemy either. The Maelstrom was infested by orc wags, chaos-worshipping mutant hordes, pirate empires, both humans and xenos in origin, and in some cases even chaos warbands lingering in the warp vortex of the Maelstrom, that meshed the reality and the immaterium together inside its tendrils.
But what is the Maelstrom exactly?
Glad you asked, Pio. The Maelstrom is classified by the Imperium as a warp storm. It is a dark and twisting light in the warp, a place where the universe and the Immaterium mesh with each other. It is located in the dense stellar masses of the galactic core, and near a linear path between the core of the galaxy and Holy Terra. The Maelstrom covers an area many hundreds of light years across. It is a storm of nebulae, dust and stellar materials, dense enough that countless stars and worlds have long been lost in it. Controlling it is impossible. Patrolling it is by itself an incredible task to accomplish. It is considered more stable than most other warp storms on record. And there is evidence that it exists from before mankind evolved at all, making it older than the Eye of Terror itself. But it is a very dangerous territory, especially because of its partial stability. It serves as an haven for all manners of corsairs, renegades, outcasts, exiles, and forgotten horrors. From the traitor legions to the elders base kin. Even the Death Watch estimates that at any given time, at least 20 major orc infestations and pirate kingdoms made their home in the Maelstrom, moving war to each other's and coming out of his cloak just to raid and pillage. But there is worse stalking the radiant darkness of the Maelstrom. It is a warp storm, a point of constant interface between the real and the unreal, between reality and the warp. In fact, demonic incursions and the predations of spectral entities such as Sagan and Alghasts are common at the points within the Maelstrom where the materium and the immaterium overlap. The planets that whirl inside the storm are tainted by chaos in some way, and the storm itself is not static either. It is known that it periodically enlarges and shrinks, and it varies in turbulence over time. The locations inside of it can't be relied entirely to remain where they were last time they were encountered. Different savants and explorators over the centuries were drawn to the dark mysteries of the Maelstrom, trying to map it or understand a pattern on how it shifted. Most have gone mad or became lost inside the Maelstrom to never be seen again. But those that have left behind decipherable records have often compared the Maelstrom's pattern to the breath of slumbering gods, or the encephalographic patterns of a nightmares-infested mind.
Why do people live here?
But why does the Imperium have any interest in what is in all a shithole?
For a very simple reason, Pio. You see, even if the region is extremely dangerous, between unpredictable phenomena like ionic rifts, null zones, and nomadic singularities, the Imperium is interested mainly in the Maelstrom Zone, also known as the Maelstrom Adjacent Autonomous Imperial Resource Extraction Grid 004358, a territory near the Maelstrom of barely habitable space, but that at the same time is rich with the rare resources found only near the galactic core. The worlds in the Maelstrom Zone are rich of rare minerals, isotopes, and crystalline deposits that are rare if not unknown anywhere else in the galaxy. They were so sought after that there is proof of the Maelstrom Zone having human presence even during the Dark Age of technology. But, like many other things, this wealth didn't attract humans alone, but also a countless number of humanity's enemies in the zone. As everybody can imagine, in a territory so dangerous, the few inhabitable planets and outposts of the Imperium will become beacons of influence and strength inside the Maelstrom Zone. And during the 38th and 39th millennia, several rose to prominence. These few vital worlds formed the links in a distant chain that allowed the resources of the Maelstrom Zone to be extracted and transported from the zone to the deposits and coffers of more established sectors away from the Maelstrom. Of these, 3 were the most important links in the chain, and they were the star systems of Cynax, Sagan, and Badab. And the first event in the chain that will turn the Maelstrom Zone into a war zone would in fact be the death of the world of Cynax. The heavily militarized Hive-world of Cynax in the star system that bore its name was, by mid-M41, the most populated sphere in the northern Maelstrom Zone. Cynax was a key world in the control of the region, a safe port for vessels and a bulwark against aggressors that tried to assault its territory. But in the year 557 M41, suddenly it succumbed to corruption from within and attack from without. The planet fell into a violent civil war when death cults that had formed in the Underhive emerged from its hive sinks in the tens of thousands, indiscriminately killing and razing entire city districts, uncaring of the cost in lives or consequences of it. And while the fighting enraged, Chaos forces emerged from the Maelstrom to assault the world. A Chaos warband of space marines known as the Reborn would aid the Death Cult in space and on the surface in the war against the loyalist elements left to defend the world. A chapter will try to help in the defense of the world. The space marines of the Mantis Warriors chapters will try and intervene from their not so distant home in the Endymion cluster. But they were not able to stop the insurrection in its tracks, and the death toll swiftly rose in the millions. This all would end when the Death Cultists gained access to part of the planet's military defense missile silos, and in a maniacal and psychotic rage, they unleashed a rain of atomic and plasma warheads which shattered its hive cities and succeeded in disrupting the planet's orbit for several years. The planet was engulfed in a permanent winter, radioactive fallouts, and tectonic upheavals that annihilated all life left on Cynax.
Reminds me of what happened to the planet of Krieg. Who was it that bombed it into becoming a death world again?
Don't ask that. You will summon Janovic, and there can't be 2 autists of 40k in the same room. See what you have done, Pio?
So, the atomic rain that bombed Krieg into near oblivion was unleashed by the legendary Colonel Jurten. The loyalists defending Ferrograd were surrounded and greatly outnumbered. The Imperium was not able to reinforce them. It was a desperate action of last resort. The many nuclear explosions destroyed large part of the traitor hives and armies and turned the tide of the war. It would take 500 years before the Imperium returned to the destroyed planet, finding the loyalists had emerged victorious. Not only had they survived the atomic hellscape of their planet, they were ready to immediately pledge several regiments to the most hazardous war zones imaginable. That's how the Death Corps of Krieg, we all know and love, came about.
Yes, all cool, Kriegs are cool. You can go now, this is a video on the Badab War, not on Krieg.
Well, the lore about the Siege of Rax is cooler anyway.
The shockwaves of the fall of Cygnus were tremendous. Imperial control on the northern Maelstrom Zone swiftly crumbled, trade routes were severed, and contact with dozens of Imperial outposts and mining stations was swiftly lost. Distant worlds, with Cygnus reduced to a scavengers-infested wasteland, were completely cut off from the Imperium, and were either forced to retrench to survive, or simply slipped into a dark silence. In 1 year, after the fall of a single vital planet in the Maelstrom Zone, an expanse of space equal to a month-and-a-half journey in the warp had slipped away from the Imperium's grasp. This threatened, together with the losses of the previous centuries, the supply chains of distant worlds, and even Holy Terra itself. This, finally, forced the Adeptus Terra and the High Lords into action.
Now they act. They left one of the most important mining zones in the Maelstrom to fend for itself, to the point it was kept together by individual planets that had as defense forces just their own standing armies, and ignored for centuries all the attacks and enemies they had to repel and face. And only now that one of the bulwarks falls, they move to do something?
That is Imperial bureaucracy for you, Pio.
I see why Gilliman slaughtered all of them when they tried to make a coup against him on Terra.
The High Lords of Terra, in response to the predations from the Maelstrom on Imperial territory, emitted an Edict Imperialis that ordered to base several Space Marine chapters in the Maelstrom Zone, in order to both protect the Imperium's interest in the Maelstrom and pacify the region. The chapter of the Astral Claws, in recognition of their past glorious service to the Imperium, was given the high honor of the senior role in commanding the newly formed Maelstrom Warders. The Warders also included the fleet-based chapters of the Lamenters and Charnel Guard, who were charged with patrolling the Maelstrom outer region, and the chapter of the Mantis Warriors, that were already based in the nearby Endymion cluster.
Yes, the Lamenters, my boys!
When has any story involving the Lamenters been good for the Lamenters, Pio?
Oh no, the Lamenters, my boys!
Now, I think it is the best moment to give all the chapters a small introduction, so that people are familiar with them for the events that are going to transpire. Let's start from the Mantis Warriors. This chapter in particular, before being assigned to the Maelstrom Warders, had always served and protected the Imperium in solitude. The Mantis Warriors are of an unknown founding, even if it is estimated that they could be from the 8th founding of M34. They descended from a rare line of the White Scars, being a successor chapter of a second founding successor chapter called the Marauders. Like the White Scars, they are renowned for their skills at guerrilla warfare, including devastating ambushes and sudden overwhelming assaults. Skills they honed from always defending and deploying in far-flung borders frontiers of the Imperium of Men. Their chapter master by the time they joined the Warders was Yarvan Sartak. Then we have the Charnel Guard. This chapter is a bit of a mystery. They are believed to have been established in the 3rd founding, and because of their founder, Dominion Zephon, are also believed to be of Blood Angel's descendants. The theory that they are a 3rd founding successor chapter is given by the war relics they wield in battle. The chapter is in fact in possession of not 1, but 3 Fellblades super heavy tanks, war machines so rare to see in the 31st millennium that the few remaining Fellblades in possession of any chapter of Space Marines are kept in stasis and rarely deployed. They also wield a formidable fleet of Fire Raptor gunships, they too considered super rare pieces of Imperial technology, virtually unseen from the days of the Great Crusade and Horus Heresy, at least unseen in great numbers. Their chapter master's identity when they joined the Maelstrom Warders was, and still is, unknown. The Lamenters, instead, are a fan-favorite chapter of the 40k universe. They are part of the 21st Founding, also known as the Curse Founding. They are a fleet-based chapter descending from the blood of Sanguinius. As part of the Curse Founding, they are cursed with an extreme level of bad luck, with constant tragedies happening to them out of nowhere and with no explanation. to the point that even other Space Marine chapters called them accursed and haunted. When they were ordered to join the Maelstrom Warders, they were accustomed to fighting alone and forgotten, with many in the Imperium looking at them with superstitious mistrust for the unfavorable events that followed every chapter engagement or even victory. To the point that when they joined the Warders, they were for the first time ever given a degree of respect and honor from the warriors of the Astral Claws they fought with side by side, and especially from their chapter master, that would grant them not only the assistance of the Astral Claws, but also the materials to maintain and strengthen their chapter in the Maelstrom. The Lamenters had, for the first time from their creation, found camaraderie with another chapter, and this built strong ties between them and the Astral Claws. Their chapter master when they were added to the Maelstrom Warders was Malakim Foros. And last, but not least, especially because they will be the center of the entire conflict of the Badab War, we have the Astral Claws. This chapter is estimated was created in the 10th founding. They were the most honored Space Marines chapter assigned to the Warders, and they had a long list of honors and battlefield triumphs. They were honored with even their banner being displayed in front of the Eternity Gate of the Throne Room of the Emperor, together with all other most honorable chapters that served the Emperor with loyalty and honor. In their case for having fought and defended the Imperium during the 5th Black Crusade. A chapter focused on martial duty and absolute loyalty. They see themselves as the will of the Emperor incarnate, and because of their high standing reputation with the High Lords, they will be chosen to have overall command on the other chapters of the Warders in the defense and pacification of the Maelstrom Zone. Their chapter master at the time they joined the Warders was Rovik Blake. Rovik Blake that for some reason isn't mentioned in the notable members of the Astral Claws chapter of the Lexicanum page that collects their info, thing that I consider enough to add one more to the Lexicanum light counter.
How are you still allowed on that wiki?
In any case, in 587 and 41, after the formation of the Warders, the Astral Claws arrived in the Maelstrom Zone and took over an orbital battle station in the strategically vital Badab system to become their fortress monastery and base of operations. Once all chapters had been established in the system, supported by the permanent detachment of an Imperial naval squadron assigned to the Maelstrom Zone for convoy protection duties and search and destroy missions, the Warder chapters quickly stabilized the surrounding area and purged the inner zone of the Maelstrom Zone from heretical and Xenos elements that had taken control in that region, bringing a dozen planets back into Imperial control. Once again, the wealth of the Maelstrom Zone began to flow into the wider Imperium. The greatest of these operations will be conducted in the Scourge campaign that started in 640 and 41 and ended in 651 and 41, in which the Astral Claws and their allies conducted a series of major combat operations deep inside the heart of the Maelstrom Zone. They were the first Imperial force to do so in centuries, operation that was made possible by the great amount of intelligence gathered in 50 years of active combat duty in the Maelstrom by the Mantis warriors. The Warders were able to pinpoint and destroy dozens of enemy strongholds and outposts, and even root out and kill many infamous renegades during the campaign. In a battle at Tuskar's Wound during the Scourge operation, the Mantis warriors had their vengeance against the reborn warband of Chaos Space Marines, avenging the losses they suffered during the fall of Cynax. But despite the success of the Warders, the campaign had to end when the Charnel Guard, one of the Space Marine chapters of the Warders of the Maelstrom, was abruptly withdrawn from the Maelstrom Zone entirely by direct intervention of the Adeptus Terra. The ties of the chapter to the Warders were severed, and they were redeployed to the Thanatos Crusade that was taking place in the Veiled region. The sudden loss of a quarter of their Space Marine forces effectively halted the campaign, and the Astral Claws hastily petitioned for a replacement chapter to be assigned to the Warders of the Maelstrom, but the replacement was denied.
The High Lords really suck at their job.
If they didn't suck at it, why do you think they tried to stage a coup against Gilliman, Pio? The Warders kept defending the Maelstrom, suffering great losses and setbacks with now a quarter less of their Space Marines to deploy in battle. And things would only get worse when 20 years later, in 681 and 41, a previously unknown Space Hulk, designated as the Unallowed Heart, appeared at the edge of the Maelstrom Zone. The Hulk was a twisted conglomeration of mangled cityscapes and lost ships, and his souls were completely invaded and controlled by demonic entities. And all that came into contact with it were riven with madness and desire to end their own lives. Several squadrons of ships, and even an Astral Claws strike cruiser, were lost with their crews in an attempt to intercept the Unallowed Heart as it laid waste to several outposts, before it slipped through the warp again, this time reappearing in orbit of the colony world of Eshunna. A quarter of the planet population died in a single night of carnage, through waves of endless people ending their own existence, murderous rampages caused by madness, and wanton hysteria. For some reason, only the Space Marines of the Lamenter's chapter seemed to be able to draw close to the Space Hulk without being subjected immediately to its baleful spell. But even they began to succumb to it, as the ghostly specters of the dead and damned assailed them mercilessly. Unflinching, despite the unholy horrors and terrors they faced, the Lamenters used a combination of close-range bombardment and desperate boarding actions against the warp-haunted Hulk, which succeeded in forcing the monstrous thing away from the planet of Eshunna. The Lamenters, though, didn't stop in their assault, and finally the Dark Star and presence at the heart of the Hulk broke under their sustained onslaught.
The wave of coherent hate slammed into the strike cruiser like a hurricane against a tiny ship at sea. The psychic malice permeating everything as the breached chamber around him burned with white darkness, and Richter screamed as fresh daggers stabbed into his body and soul. Phantasmal horrors assailed the Lamenter's captain, and the cries of countless damned souls claimed by the night moaned their endless agony and outraged betrayal at him. The face of every man, woman and child he'd ever tried to save and lost came to him with crushing clarity. Every life he'd taken, every comrade he'd lost. "I am the scions of Sanguinius," he whispered, defying the horrors invading his mind. "Mine is the glory of sacrifice eternal. Mine is the duty that never ends." Dimly, as the visions left him, he saw the hook-fingered, half-shadow skeletal things crawling lustfully across the decks and walls of the breached chamber, feasting on the dying. He heard their razor-sharp talons skittering at the plates of his armor, half real and half unreal. Abruptly, the ghostlight failed, and the bridge was plunged again into darkness as the wave of psychic nightmares radiating from the Hulk passed over. Behind him, somewhere, a Terra loom exploded like a shrapnel bomb, and new alarm sirens howled as the holosphere stuttered back into life. Richter reached his goal at last, and collapsed on top of the bombardier's console like a puppet with his strings cut, coughing out a mass of stagnant blood and teeth across the activation panel. With his last ebbing strength, he pushed aside the body of Brother Falco, his master gunner. The eye lenses of the dead Space Marine's helm burned out to black holes. Beneath him, Status Auguries blinked ruddily, and firing litanies spooled by at crazy speeds as the machine spirit sought constantly to hold a weapons lock on a target that wasn't entirely within mortal reality. "Emperor bless you, Falco, and take you to your rest," he whispered. Richter slammed down his weight on the master arming lever, and seconds later was rewarded as the strike cruiser bucked and rumbled beneath him with familiar thunder. The flickering image on the holosphere was blasted and riven as the comet-like flares of macroshells hurled forth into the belly of the beast, shedding off great clouds of debris into the void and cracking the twisted arcs of its soul, which bled thick, boiling light. In the dark recess of Richter's soul, he felt his inhuman enemy scream in frustration and pain. "We also can hate." Richter smiled through the torn flesh.
The Lamenters have sacrificed over 300 Battle Brothers and 4 strike vessels in the engagement against the Space Hulk. They were literally fighting against horrific visions of deaths from their past, and people they were not able to save from previous wars. Both fallen Battle Brothers or innocents that were lost in the uncaring darkness of this accursed galaxy. But even then, they kept on fighting valiantly at the cost of their own sanity and lives to save as many people they could from the madness and destruction that the Space Hulk brought with itself. But even then, when the Ordo Malleus investigated the events, the Inquisition became critical of the Lamenter chapter for not destroying the Hulk as soon as possible, especially for the destruction it had brought to the planet of Eshunna. The judgment the Inquisition was giving was greeted with fury by the Lamenter's chapter, who cast out the Ordo Malleus deputation for their insult. This marked a point of hardship between the relationship of the Imperium of Man and the Warders during this period that came as the Warders were facing an upsurge of demonic incursions and Corsair attacks in the Maelstrom Zone that was pushing them into an increasingly defensive position in the zone, especially when the operations near the Maelstrom itself had to be suspended.
So, things are getting more dangerous, and not only are they fighting all the same to protect the people and the zone as it is their duty, but the Inquisition, that literally did nothing to help in the engagement, is critiquing the Lamenters that lost 300 Marines to destroy the Space Hulk.
I thought we had established that the Inquisition are idiots in the video about the Months of Shame, Pio. Anyway, in 715 and 41, after a series of heavy orc raids coming from within the Maelstrom struck deep into the Badab sector, Chapter Master Rovik Blake of the Astral Claws went against his own doctrine, and decided to pursue the orcs back in the Maelstrom itself, using the chapter's battle barge, the Seraph of Judgment, at the head of a large strike force. The Astral Claws reappeared from the warp into real space soon after the orc terror ships arrived at their rock bases, in the vast shattered planetary debris field orbiting the colossal star of El Sirir. A battle erupted. Chapter Master Rovik Blake, who had led the Astral Claws for the last 2 centuries, fell in single combat with the orc war boss Vorg Menburn, and although the Space Marines would slay thousands of greenskins in the battle and destroy a good portion of the orcs' base, the Seraph of Judgment was badly damaged, and the Astral Claws were forced to retreat. When the survivors returned to the Badab system, a new chapter master had to be chosen to lead the Astral Claws and the Warders of the Maelstrom. And, with popular acclaim of his peers, in 715 and 41, a new chapter master was chosen. The new leader of the Astral Claws Space Marine chapter and the Warders of the Maelstrom was an Astarte known as Lugft Huron.
The music tells me that is not a good thing.
It isn't. This is the first step that will spark the Badab War. Doesn't the name Lugft Huron ring a bell, Pio?
No, not exactly.
He is now known under another name, Pio, as the second most powerful champion of chaos the galaxy has ever seen, as the leader of the giant faction and warband of space marines and pirates known as the Red Corsairs. Lugft Huron is the former name of the chaos champion known as Huron Blackheart. Lugft Huron was a truly exceptional war... Wait, his name is Lugft Huron, but the Wiki Lexicanum invert the G and the F. Both the wikis get the name of the main antagonist of the Badab War wrong. I am calm. Ma che cazzo ho scritto queste cazzo di wiki per arrivare a sbagliare il nome dell'antagonista principale dell'intera storia? Io imparo una cazzo di lingua sul bus per amore di questa lore ed il coglione che scrive le wiki non ha neanche la decenza di azzeccare i nomi? Ma ci sarebbe da prendervi a schiaffi a due finché non diventano dispari per quanto inaccurate sono queste cazzo di wiki, grandissimi figli di... Ok, I'm calm now. Returning to the video, Lugft Huron was a truly exceptional warrior. By his deeds alone, he would have been considered a legendary figure of any Space Marine chapter, that would have taken pride in his name being part of his own history. He was a masterful and charismatic leader, as well as a skilled general, to the point that his abilities were said to rival even legendary warriors of the Great Crusade and Horus Heresy. Much of the records pertaining to the Astral Claws have been lost since the Badab War, but there is evidence that Lugft Huron first came to prominence in the Astral Claws as a scout novitiate during the later stages of the Rebus Crusade, where he fought as part of the Astral Claws forces in the destruction of the outcast Eldar Exodite ward of Lilogir, where even under extremely heavily psychic assault, he managed to kill an Eldar warlock with his bare hands. After he was assigned to the Devastator Reserves after his rising to initiate of the chapter, he proved once again to be exceptional as a leader and as a tactician in a number of battles. He also rose over time to become a master of ordnance after showing skill in plotting out fire support patterns during battles. He moved rapidly through the ranks, and his skills brought him to join first the 3rd Battle Company of the chapter, and then to rise to the 1st Company Veterans of the chapter, where his skills and abilities saw him raise to command over Space Marines with decades more of practical and battle experience than he had. Huron excelled even in the 1st Company Veterans, and was soon appointed as the captain of the Astral Claws 4th Company.
Wait, you can be appointed as captain of other companies after serving in the 1st company?
It is a little known fact that all captains of all companies of every chapter are veterans that served in the first company at one point in time, with very few exceptions ever noted to this rule. In the role of the 4th company captain, the true skill of Huron blossomed. His tactics and strategic prowess saw the Astartes under his command defeat enemies many times their own numbers and strength. But his rapid ascension in the chapter wasn't universally accepted by the Marines of the Astral Claws. Some saw the fanatically loyal following some of his brothers showed for him as a threat, suspecting that they were more loyal to him than to the chapter, or even the Emperor himself.
How can a marine with this level of skill ever become not only a renegade, but also a champion of chaos?
Remember how the saying goes, Pio, the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Foreshadowing.
After raising to the rank of chapter master after the death of his predecessor in 697 and 41... Wait, 697 and 41? But the chronology of the war says that he was elected in 715 and 41, thing that is both written in the old Imperial Armour and the new Imperial Armour.
Is Imperial Armour contradicting itself in the same book?
Yes! Games Workshop writers really need to double check what the fuck they write. Anyway, after his ascension to Chapter Master in 715 and 41, he became the youngest warrior to ever attain this rank in the chapter's history. He was already established as a charismatic leader and extremely skilled tactician, and he got to work immediately to reorganize the Astral Claw's strategic deployment and establishing a policy to expand its chapter fleet, which had become badly depleted as the situation got worse in the Maelstrom. They started to include in their ranks Corsair ships that they captured in aggressive raids, repairing them and restoring them to full service to serve in the Maelstrom and Astral Claws fleets. He also established with his fellow chapter masters of the Warders a scorched planet policy against their enemies, and started amassing exterminatus level weapons for this exact purpose, reducing several fringe worlds that in the past provided renegade ships with armor into lifeless husks. In 718 and 41, a failed coup against the Badab Primaris royalty led to a civil war erupting on the High World. Civil war that forced the Astral Claws to step in and crush the conflict as brutally as they could. In the aftermath, elements behind the coup were revealed under interrogation to have connections to off-world raiders and smuggling rings, which they had used as a source of arms and tainted drugs to fuel the failed uprising. The matter was brought directly in front of Huron for judgment, as riots and revolts had started flaring across the planet once again. Lugft Huron was outraged that such a betrayal could fester insidiously behind his back, and after having seen what happened to the planet and system of Cynax, he decided to take matters into his own hands. The Space Marines of the Astral Claws swiftly reimposed order once more on Badab Primaris, employing shattering force and executing much of the planet's ruling class, as well as purging the Hive cities on the planet of anyone they perceived as morally recidivist. It is here that Huron would also take on the mantle of planetary ruler. Styling himself the Tyrant of Badab, he claimed the Badab sectors and all inhabited planets surrounding the hospitable region of the void around it, declaring them as his chapter fiefdom. In his own words,
To better protect these worlds and the souls that dwell upon them, in the glory of the Emperor.
He did so echoing in his pronouncement the example and precedents set by the sovereign realm of Ultramar, that is ruled by the chapter of the Ultramarines. In the decades that came, the wholesale purging of the ruling elites of all the nearby systems in the Badab sector followed. A number of Astral Claws watch bastions were established, all the while Huron's chosen servants and political allies were slowly placed in positions of power. Huron's power also grew and was cemented by the formation of a new military force, created in a massive reorganization of the uneven and often isolationist native planetary defense forces of the region. These forces now followed a standard dictated by Huron, as well as a unified command structure. This new military force will be known as the Tyrant's Legion.
Can you elaborate a bit more on the Tyrant Legion?
Sure, Pio. The Tyrant's Legion were an highly effective force. They will be vital in the events of the Badab War. As I already said, they were extremely organized and standardized instead of separated forces. They will become Huron's parallel force to the Imperial Guard of the wider Imperium. They were loyal only to Huron and the Astral Claws, that they venerated as living gods touched by the Emperor. They were an army of humans more akin to the armies of the Imperium during the Great Crusade. Human forces integrated with Space Marine contingents. Their mere existence broke one of the tenets of the Imperium. Huron integrated these forces in the chain of command on a standing basis, and in doing so, he was trying to concentrate an extreme amount of military power in Badab and keep it under his personal command. This gave the chapter too much power, a thing frowned upon from the dark days of the Horus heresy, as the legions were broken down and separated from human armies exactly to prevent any single chapter of Marines from wielding enough power to cause a civil war in the Imperium that would end up causing nightmarish levels of death and destruction. But their creation served a very shadowy purpose in what would become the Badab War.
What purpose?
You see, Pio, in the middle of the 700s of the 31st millennium, the regular Astral Claw's gene seed submission to the Magus in Vigila of the Adeptus Mechanicus became infrequent and incomplete. Every chapter is required to send a portion of their gene seed back to the Mechanicus regularly for purity checks, mutation screenings, but also to be collected and stored in case of need of the chapter or a new founding of Marines. But the gene seed of the Astral Claws simply stopped reaching Mars at one point. Although it was a cause of concern, such matters are not uncommon when a Space Marine chapter is involved, especially for those deployed in dangerous areas of the galaxy, like the border, or that are fighting in a crusade. Or simply the chapter might have the need to withhold the gene seed submission because of sustained battlefield losses. But the longer such an omission persists, the greater the risk something else is happening, and darker the motive at work could be. Later evidence would indicate that this was the case with the Astral Claws, and this, together with Pride, would be the first great sin against tradition that would lead the Astral Claws to fall to heresy, and the Badab War to burn inside the Maelstrom.
But what does the Tyrant's Legion have to do with it?
See, Pio, the fact the High Lords recalled one of the chapters defending the Maelstrom and took away a quarter of the Space Marines fighting in the Warders, and the Imperium's general lack of cooperation with the Warders in the decades after was not a thing Huron took lightly. To ease the defense of the Maelstrom and ease the expanse of his domain, he would withhold the gene seed that had to be sent to the Adeptus Mechanicus, to use it to create more and more Marines and expand his Astartes force, specifically the chapter of the Astral Claws, over the 1000 Marines limit set in the Codex Astartes, a thing that is, in all, heresy in the Imperium of Men. And because, as we discussed, Huron is not stupid, and people will notice the increased amount of Astral Claws present at any given time under their banner, he would use the Tyrant's Legion to send around task forces of Marines to train it and aid it in combat around the Maelstrom Zone, both to keep his domain in check and help the human forces defeat the horrors of the Maelstrom, but also to hide them, so nobody will notice how many Astral Claws were truly part of the chapter when he exceeded the maximum limit. By 790 M41, the defense of the Badab sector was stronger than at any point in its history. The Tyrant's Legion worth was proved in the repulsions of separate Corsair raids on the Cabalus and Minestra station. The chapters of the Warders were finally freed from their defensive stance, and conducted a series of lightning raids into the outlying areas of their domain to harass and destroy targets of opportunity, like on Bloody Bones and other heretic or Xenos-controlled spheres in the Maelstrom Zone. The fame of the Tyrant of Badab grew, his reputation reaching even outside of the Maelstrom Zone as his number of victories increased. Pirate activity was curtailed, and the Maelstrom Zone reached levels of production never before achieved. Spurred by their success, Lugft sent his servants to undertake a pilgrimage to deliver a formal petition to Terra. This document made a detailed case for completely subduing and conquering the Maelstrom and the surrounding areas, and this will bring great benefits to the general Imperium. But, in order to achieve this, the document set out the case for a massively augmented deployment of Space Marine chapters to the Maelstrom Warders ranks. In fact, suggesting that even an entire new founding of chapters might be needed to meet the plan's needs. The petition was dismissed on the grounds that the Imperium's requirements were better met elsewhere. 748 M41. After further requests to redistribute resources from the Maelstrom Zone were denied, Huron decided to withhold Badab Primaris planetary tithe to the Administratum, and further blocked the passage of trade through his realms, in protest over the Administratum's failure to provide him and his allies with sufficient resources to guard and police the Maelstrom.
What's a tithe?
The Imperial Tithe is a form of payment given by every planet of the Imperium to the Administratum. It is a form of redistribution of resources to the wider Imperium from every planet. It can come in human life as regiments of the Imperial Guard or Psykers, or usually a combination of those and materials or production output from the planet it is paid from. Few worlds are exempt from paying the tithes, such as Astartes chapter worlds or Inquisitorial strongholds, and the Mechanicus Forge worlds instead have their own Levi structures in place, hidden within the shadowy empire of the Machine Cult. The tithes are used to ensure human survival, but especially to ensure the constant function of the Imperial war machine. Tithes can be irregular because of various numbers of situations, but usually they must always in one way or another be paid.
So it is a tax.
Yes, it is a tax.
So the administratum is just space IRS.
A bit of a simplification, but yes.
Okay,
What are you doing with that bolter?
getting ready.
For what?
I don't care who the IRS sends. I'm not paying taxes. Huron did nothing wrong.
The blockade of Huron had a double effect, as much of Badab's output was made up through the refinement of ores and crystals garnered from the scattered mining outpost of the Pale Stars region of the Maelstrom Zone. Additionally, as the main viable warp routes of the area passed through Badab Primaris, the bulk of the supply of minerals of this vital region had been cut off as well. The Tyrant of Badab justified this refusal in the terms of the Astral Claw's role as defenders of the Maelstrom Zone, diverting the industrial resources and manpower is commandeered to directly supplement the Badab sector defenses, as well as augment the Maelstrom fleet detachment and fortify key worlds under his domain. This manifested in the Maelstrom Zone as an increase in space-based defenses, encircling the outer and inner spheres in a ring of steel. While on Badab Primaris, Huron ordered demolished the ancient citadel of the ruling Dominars, and instead erected what was to become the legendary, hugely fortified Palace of Thorns, to its specifications and designs. This ongoing political situation was causing heated controversy within the Adeptus Terra and the course of the Segmentum, that had to receive and deliver those ties in one way or the other. At its crux was a fault line that had stayed hidden beneath the rigid structure of Imperial law, the crushing entitlement of the Administratum to the Imperial tithe, and the ancient rights of Astartes commanders to defend the Imperium by any means necessary. This turmoil would last more than a century and a half, during which the military operations of the Astral Claws and the Maelstrom Warders were to carry on as usual against a backdrop of wars and intentions with the Administratum and the authorities of the Segmentum in which the Maelstrom was. The lack of these materials and ties would hit strongly a sector known as the Carthago sector. For more than 11 centuries, Cartan lords and planetary governors had held the charter to distribute the industrial output of the Maelstrom Zone, and guard its passage from the Administratum-controlled supply fortress on Sagan all the way to the western Segmentum Ultima and beyond. Isolated by vast distances of turbulent and warring space from the authorities at Cardunia, the Cartans had long grown fat and decadent, protected from the predations of the beast and the alien by the blood and toil of more strife-torn realms. The only masters they ever feared were the Segmentum Procurators General, who demanded their due, regardless of whether the wells that had so long supplied them had suddenly run dry.
I still think Huron was right.
For now, yes. Later a bit more, but after it, you will see, Pio. But while the actions of the Astral Claws were angering organizations and people hundreds of light years distant, the Astral Claws that were now at full strength and freed from the inglorious weight of garrison duty moved to intervene in the aftermath of the infamous Fourth Quadrant Rebellion. They answered a general call to arms among the Astartes of the region, and the Astral Claws dispatched a powerful force under the direct personal command of Lugft Huron against one of the last major stronghold systems of the revolt, beyond the southern borders of the Maelstrom Zone. When the Imperial forces gathered for the assault, Huron was elected battle leader by common consent of a mixed task force of Space Marines, comprising companies from the Astral Claws, Firehawks, White Scars, and Celestian Guard chapters, backed by Krieg and Kolsek Imperial Guard regiments, and the Titans of Legio Venator. Under Huron's inspired command, the task force ruthlessly eradicated the heavily fortified Lycanthos system of traitors and chaos forces in less than a year. However, Stybor Lazarek, the chapter master of the Firehawks, wrote that he was not given command of the campaign over Huron, is known to have borne a grudge against the Astral Claws since this time, a grudge that would soon erupt into armed conflict. Returning to the Maelstrom Zone in glorious victory, the Astral Claws quickly sought to capitalize on their achievements, and in 869 M41, at the instigation of Lugft Huron, the Black Templars declared a crusade of wrath into the Maelstrom, assaulting it from its eastward marches.
Can we go one lore video without having the Black Templars involved?
What do you mean?
40k lore on the Marines against the Inquisition. Black Templars involved in defending and aiding the Celestial Lions. The Cacodominus and the Catalexis heresy. Heresy. The Black Templars fight an alien cyborg Alpha Plus Psyker and take his head as a trophy. The only 2 videos of lore after the Horus Heresy on the entire channel, and in both of them the Black Templars are involved. This will be the third in only 3 videos we made that cover events taking place after the Horus Heresy. Even in the video The Importance of Lore, you chose lore of the Black Templars to change by adding Steven Seagal in it.
Shut up, Pio. While the Black Templars were assaulting the Maelstrom, the Astral Claws, Lamenters and Mantis Warriors launched their own assaults into the pathways of the Great Storm, from its southern and northeastern approaches. Thanks to the Tyrant strategic planning and the Metal of Space Marine chapters involved, no fewer than 23 alien or heretic stronghold worlds were purged, including several on the Maelstrom fringes that had fallen to the Wordbearers and their apostate followers.
Fuck Erebus.
At the height of the campaign, having fought deeper than any recorded Imperial fleet had even attempted, the Astral Claws and Mantis Warriors directed their assaults to smash the subhuman Flesh Hunters of the Howling Gyre. At the culmination of the battle against the Flesh Hunters, the Astral Claws First Company veterans, led by Huron himself, fought their way deep within the foul creature carcass vaults, before planting and unleashing the Life Eater virus contained in virus bombs upon the abominations. With this single act, they ended a threat that had plagued the Imperium since before the Age of Apostasy, affording a great and loaded victory, but once more, wider events intervened to put a premature end to the Astral Claws' plans. The Black Templars were suddenly called away to aid the beleaguered realm of Ultramar in the wake of the First Tyrannic War. Already having suffered substantial losses in the campaign, and wary of being cut off, and with readings of the Emperor's Tarot portending oncoming doom, the Warders chapters were forced to withdraw from the Maelstrom, and could not complete their objective, much to Huron's fury. But matters worsened even more, not only inside the Maelstrom Zone, but with the outside Imperium as well. The threat of High Fleet Behemoth and the First Tyrannic War had left the defenses of the Segmentum in complete disarray, and slumbering threats as far-flung as the Eye of Terror and the Ghoul Stars lurched once more into life. And everywhere there were wars and rumors of wars, revolts, and strange phenomena. Inside the Maelstrom Zone, trouble again flared up, and enemies flooded from dark places. A marauding orc force of a size unseen since the Battle of Elsiris rampaged through the Endymion cluster, and the ancient world of Fargos X on the edge of the Maelstrom Zone simply disappeared, never to be seen again. Convoys were attacked in ever greater numbers, and gas ships and etheric storms of the Maelstrom itself waxed greatly and reached out. In the Warpstorm's baleful light, cult-led revolts wrecked the scattered mining outpost of the Pale Stars, and also struck closer to home as cult activity was uncovered in the shadows of the Badab sector, spurring on a series of merciless purges by the Tyrant's followers. As crisis followed crisis in the dying years of the 800s of M41, Lugft Huron saw the Maelstrom Zone slipping from his grasp, and all the victories the Warders had gained beginning to crumble, and so moved to tighten his grip, unaware that elsewhere events were moving against him. But something dark and far more sinister had happened as the Warders were returning from their crusade deep inside the Maelstrom. The records of this period picture Huron as taciturn and withdrawn when he returned from the crusade, locking himself away in the chapter archives for days, refusing to see anyone, keeping long silent vigils in the fortress monastery Panoptic Solar, or gazing unblinking for hours at holosphere depicting the Maelstrom Zone, and the baleful vortex that dominated its stars. Observers have gone on to say that it was during this time that Lugft Huron fell from grace, denied once again the goals he had spent his life fighting for, seeing his ultimate glory snatched from his hands at the last moment by those he should call masters and allies unhinged him, or that he gave into hubris and false pride. Some have gone so far to suggest that during the Crusade of Wrath deep within the nightmarish vortex of the Maelstrom, some strange taint wormed its way into his heart. But it is as likely that the darkness in Lugft Huron's soul was no more or less than the same Empyrean fire that called him to greatness, and made him such an effective and innovative warrior. But as Huron returned from the Crusade of Wrath, while traveling in the warp inside the Maelstrom, his mind lost for once again coming so close to greatness just to fail to achieve it for the interference of the Imperium and its bureaucrats, Huron stared into the warp mindlessly, unknowing that when you stare into the warp stares back. And this is where we will stop for today. Lots of ground to cover still, but we made a dent.
What? But I wanted to know more. It is better than your PowerPoint on Tau hooves and why they are better than human feet.
We will cover everything, Pio, but for now, let's take a pause and drink something. You can take a beverage from the freezer behind you.
From how long has that been there?
It was always there, from the day the first refrigerators were invented.
Then that's a virus bomb.
Yes. The story of the Badab War will continue in part 2, The Flames of War.